Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Invicti Year in Review, where Dan and I will talk about the year in review from an AppSec perspective. Not just an AppSec perspective, but maybe some of the things that we've also seen in the industry over the past year. And this will be a loose related format where Dan and I will just discuss some topics and things that we've seen. So first, some brief introductions. My name is Frank Catucci. I'm the CTO and head of security research at Invicti Security. And I am very lucky today to have joining me Dan Murphy. Dan, quick intro.
Hey, my name is Dan Murphy, and I'm the chief architect here at Invicti Security. I have been doing security ever since I was a young boy reading 2600 and exploring the world of bulletin boards. So it's a passion of mine, and I'm always enjoy the opportunity to just chat about the topics and catch up. So this is going to be fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so 2023 in review, very interesting year, not only from a security perspective, but from an AppSec perspective for a couple of different things. First off, we're coming off the heels of probably one of the most, talked about vulnerabilities that occurred in 2022. So we thought, hey, maybe 2023 can't be this bad from that perspective. We made it through a fair amount of months, Dan, and then we saw something very interesting. So I'd say let's dive in with Move It, right? Let's dive in with that. I know that I've received no fewer than two letters where I've been affected personally and had my 18th offer for credit monitoring within the last 2 years. Um, but just curious on your take as far as I'm really curious on your take as far as like the overall impact from the beginning detection phases and how this kind of came about all the way to like, holy cow, here we are now in Q4 closing out the end of the year, and we're still seeing some effects from this type of vulnerability. Whereas we were just coming off the healing process of a log4 shell4 from the year before. So
Yeah.
in your opinion, how does this really impacted a lot of the landscape from AppSec this year?
Yeah, so Move It is really interesting. It's interesting in that it's not like Log4j, which was this massive earthquake that affected a piece of infrastructure software that was built into a lot of other pieces of software. Log4j was a Lego brick that was used in many, many models that are out there. Move It was different. It was a full component, something that sat on the edge of an enterprise and provided secure access to transfer files in and out. So individual pieces of software weren't built with Move It, but the overall systems, the bigger component of how healthcare and education and state governments work, those all did have aspects of the Move It solution integrated into them. We did a great talk out at Black Hat this past summer that kind of went into some of the details. But what I found very interesting about the Move It vulnerability were a few things. One, it affected software that was on the edge of the enterprise. The job of Move It is to secure file transfer back and forth from entities that are outside of the castle walls to the inside of the castle walls. That positioning of software is the type of the type of positioning that really makes it vulnerable to attack. And we saw patterns when we dove in and took a look at the actual way that those Move It attacks were performed. We found a lot of the individual components that made up the Move It attack were all very recognizable to
Yeah.
persons that background in DAST. And that to me is what was really fascinating, is that you had a very big attack that affected millions of people, massive entities throughout the private sector, education, and a lot of state governments. But at the same time, when you pull back the covers, it's the same pieces, the same bits that we have seen in the past. So to me, it was interesting to see that what was a big new attack was actually a lot of very familiar techniques that we've seen employed that are not unique to Move It, that are
Right.
widespread attacks that they're out there.
Yeah, and two of those pieces for me were super interesting, right? We look all the way back, Dan, at like the beginning of, oh, I don't know, the Web Application Hackers Handbook, right? Or we dig into like the first version of the OWASP Top 10. And what do we have, right? We have these very basic level injection attacks, right? So if we break down Move It and we take a look at the components, we needed a SQL injection, right? Basically, nothing novel there. And then how do we finish it off? Maybe we paired up a deserialization vulnerability with it. And we look at those two things and we're like, okay, neither of these is this elite sophistication. We have a SQL injection and a deserialization attack. We have this where you could also argue privilege escalation in a way, right? Where you're creating this super user to be able to create other things. I mean, obviously not needed for a lot of the data exfil, but there are these type of attacks that come up with these same patterns. And that's one thing that we try to do is state to you, look, if you're running scans, if you're testing code, if you're looking for at your components all the way across the board, anything from supply chain to static code analysis to obviously dynamic testing, we are looking for these type of vulnerabilities inherently, right? So we're always looking for those SQL injections and deserialization attacks. This one happened to be fairly interesting due to how it occurred, right? And so it was this, bespoke piece of software used for file transfer, like you mentioned, but the attacks were very, they weren't novel, right? They were things that we've known about for years, and it's just interesting to see how these type of attacks can evolve given how long we've known about the dangers of things like injection attacks.
Yeah, and when we talk about these things being old, I actually have the issue of the Frack magazine that first talked about like these attacks in 1998. So SQL
Yeah.
injection is something that's been around for a while. And in the case of Move It, what was really fascinating is that the persons who wrote the software, they knew about SQL injection. They guarded against SQL injection. 99% of the code that they had written was aware of this vulnerability and appropriately defended against it.
Correct.
But all it takes is just kind of one vulnerability. And that's the thing that's fascinating to me is that attackers, with increased availability of automation, increased tools, kind of as things get better, the fact that that one crack can be found and then exploited is fascinating. One of the things that I find very interesting about automated security in terms of DAST is that sometimes you really need to run something that finds the needle in your software stack that is going to pick up every single piece and just replay the attacks again and again and
Yeah.
again and again. That exhaustive search of the entire space of your code is something that we found evidence that bad guys have found that one crack. So it is possible. All it takes is that moment of inattention, right? And it's really simple because as a developer, as an engineer, you realize how easy it is to let something like this through. In the case of Move It, this was an API that was not intended to be public. It was a private API. And that pattern is something that we've seen a ton. Just this presupposition that, oh, this will never happen, right? Oh, this is the side door. So if you consider like the metaphor of a bank and you've got this really nice, massive vault door that's incredibly heavy, sometimes there'll be another entrance. There's a screen door and it's hanging off of its hinges and it's got like, a bunch of the boards are hanging out. And we assume that that doesn't face the outside world, but all too often what an attacker can do is find a way to get access to that screen door. And we apply different principles of privilege, different principles of security based on whether or not we think something is publicly facing or privately facing. And a theme that I think we see is increasingly it's those presumed private vectors that are being used as a way to kind of gain access. Move It was no different. That SQL injection was it was basically in a dusty administrative API, right? That was not intended for the world to call. The attackers first exploited another bug to be able to kind of circumvent some effectively like, the bouncer at the gate that was saying you can't call this API. That's how they were able to get in. And that pattern, what I kind of jokingly refer to as, mullet security, where it's very tight validation business up front, but the private APIs are this wild party if anything goes. That's a pattern we've seen all too
Yeah.
often.
Love it. The mullet of security. I like that. And speaking of that, that wild party in the back there, Dan, there's some tried and true that goes along with this as far as like best practices. And I know that a large part of our audience will be AppSec, but I think it would be remiss not to kind of circle back on some of the best practices and things. And A couple of those that would be easier mitigations, and I'm going back to very like real basics, right? So let's perhaps use ACLs on these secure file transfers where only known entities that need that secure file transfer can access that. So is it exposed? Yes, but is it pinholed? Perhaps ACLs. And then we come into one of my favorite ones is like, okay, we're putting the different layers on here. Could there been, why don't we use some type of multi-factor authentication in these type of situations where yes, I know in this particular instance, it may or may not have been beneficial if that was exposed to begin with, but there are things that we can do from basic standpoints of utilizing best practices of old, and those things like access control, various IP restriction lists, making sure that your vulnerability is not discoverable on Shodan. Also, multi-factor authentication and those type of things. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that was super interesting to me. And that's one thing that I think can get lost in the shuffle sometimes, is that everyone's looking for that new and cool thing, whereas, as this demonstrated, you didn't need the new and cool thing to have a huge impact.
Yeah, and one of the things that I also think is somewhat apparent is that this is an example of a API not intended to be public being attacked. And I think that APIs in particular, sometimes because they don't have a visible front end, right? They don't have a GUI to an organization. In some ways, they become kind of like this secret surface of security net that nobody really knows about. Modern organizations are really glued together. APIs are the fabric that kind of binds together so many things on the internet. I remember seeing some figures a while ago indicating that API traffic was due to eclipse actual real interactive traffic over the coming years, and I believe it. And whenever you have more traffic that is now going down this headless path of APIs, that means that is where the vulnerabilities are going to be. That's where kind of the attackers are going to start looking. And I think with an organization, because business leaders don't have this visibility, it's this invisible infrastructure that makes everything work, the old adage of out of sight, out of mind can really apply. And so we've seen documented issues, breaches earlier in the year where major companies might have an API that had broken object level authentication, right? That said, hey, look, you could just do a get. And if you know this ID, we've documented cases where you could get back a lot of very personally identifiable information. So I actually think that area of APIs that are out there that are probably not the most secure thing in the world, but it's a real concern, and it's something that I
Yeah.
think that we'll see increasingly as targets of exploits. Like in some ways, a lot of APIs, no one's actively looking at it. And when it's bots that are talking to bots, when you get a human attacker, oftentimes we find that most code, unfortunately, has vulnerabilities and things that are not actively examined, right? Things that are just kind of part of the fabric of the internet. Oftentimes, those things, when you get a human looking at it, you can get some very interesting results.
Two
So I think
things.
interesting in the next year.
Yeah, two things you hit on there that I find super interesting. One is, yeah, this is a 2023 year in review. But we can also look at this as a little bit of like predictive New Year's predictions, if you will, which most of the time I don't like. But I think that there's one that we can't ignore, and that is that in 2024, the API attack surface is going to be a focal point. And again, with API traffic eclipsing, regular user-based traffic, or I would say traditional-based traffic to a web service, that is something that is obviously going to increase the attack surface, right? And then we look into how those kind of vulnerabilities are broken down, and they fall into these different categories, Dan, where we have like, okay, denial of service. We have bot abuse where like, we're doing scraping and maybe drive-bys and credential stuffing and all this other thing that we're using these machine-based bots for abuse case formats. But then we also have like the top one, right? The IDOR, the BOLA, right? Where we're having some type of access that shouldn't be given, but there's a lot of provisioning and a lot of complexity in how certain APIs talk to other APIs. And, knowing that perhaps I have a permission to do one thing and what else can I do to get those values or to get that exfiltration from a different value that I shouldn't have access to are things that are going to drive us over that next year. And I think the importance, like we talked about earlier, of saying, okay, we're doing SAST, we're doing DAST, et cetera. We also can't ignore our APIs. We need to be effectively testing, securing, and scanning and discovering those APIs on a continuous basis. And I think 2023 is just reiterating the importance of that, but 2024 might even be more prevalent in the importance of really securing APIs as a whole.
Yeah, and one of the things for me that was a great metaphor for that type of mullet security, where what is presumed to be secure, someone gets in through, was something I had seen at Black Hat this summer. Sorry, at DEF CON this summer, and I attended a talk in the car hacking village where someone exploited. They basically stole a car, right? They showed how one could attach a device that used kind of a presumed private mechanism, the CAN bus of popular vehicles that someone was able to plug in behind the front left headlight and actually send some packets onto that bus that would turn on the car. That
Yeah.
will, enable you to kind of like walk out and drive away with that vehicle. It's a great example of that. Here's something that we thought was private that an attacker can use to get control over the system. So it was a great physical way to kind of ground that trend that we're seeing.
Yeah. So let's move on to another topic. This is something that I think bothers me a little bit. And what I've been hearing is, and again, this is mixed media, right? These are things that I've seen on LinkedIn and buzz around, publications in the industry. And what I've heard is that DevOps or DevSecOps is fading away, and that's one thing that was noticed in 2023. I take a little bit of an exception with that because I really don't see it as fading away, Dan. I think this is something that matures and evolves more into a given process.
Yeah.
So earlier this year, I did a webinar with Park and Fly's CTO, Ken, and one of the things that he said was none of this is really using its usefulness. What happens is that it's a natural absorption into your existing process.
Yeah.
And when that becomes more of a, let's say, a given or a norm, that maybe you might misunderstand that the buzz or something fades from some particular term like DevSecOps. But really what happens is we're just evolving, like the secure SDLC becoming an evolution of SDLC, like DevOps or DevSecOps being an additional evolution of the secure SDLC or as a piece of it, an enhancement. And I think as these things build upon each other, you really have more of a effective and basically a dev cultural norm where some of this security is becoming built in. It's not necessarily a shift left anymore. Now we're adapting to the left that's already shifted. And so I was curious from your standpoint, right? So we come at this from a couple of different angles. I know that you probably have a really good opinion, but what is your opinion for DevOps? Like, do you see DevSecOps fading? Because I personally don't. Or like, what's your view on how this year's changed in 2023 from a DevOps perspective or security in a DevOps perspective?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's not something that goes away, but something that's normalized. And when it becomes normalized, there's simply less discussion of it as a thing. In some ways, DevSecOps is just becoming development, becoming a standard practice. Much in the same way that you see a lot of discussion about CI/CD, and it's simply a norm, right? It's like what you do, right? Gone are the days where someone would produce a release by having a developer on a laptop write some code and run some scripts and be reliant on this individual person to kind of bless the release. Now everything's automated, and in many ways, companies have no choice but to embrace that automation to be able to produce software at the scale that modern business requires. So I think it's around. I think it's probably something that is getting less talked about. A great example of this is that at some point in time, security vulnerabilities were something that was an external group. Was the cops, right? They would make sure that you were running it. They would run the scanners and come back to a development team and say you were
Stop.
naughty. You got to
Yeah.
fix. And often, frankly, at the end of a release cycle, when everyone's stressed, when everyone's trying to ship code. So now that stuff is kind of naturally migrated in a way that's almost invisible, but makes for better security. I was writing some code the other day, and I noticed that in the IDE, it's just a squiggly underneath something that I had gone to a piece of code that I didn't write that I opened up, and there was something that said, "Hey, there's an insecure deserialization here. You probably shouldn't do it." And that's in the IDE. That is something that is gone from, hey, we're going to buy a tool. Hey, we're going to talk about this. Hey, it's going to be really exciting to just normative. You could
Wait,
just say
you
fixed
you
and
use
you're
an
done, right? 10
you
seconds
use
later.
you use an IDE. This wasn't like a squiggly in Vim or anything like that, or
Oh, no, 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 no. Normally I would just be catting the bytes directly in
yeah,
binary.
yeah, yeah. Just poking. Just so one thing that you one thing that you mentioned, Dan, was scalability, modern scalability. So from my perspective, the scalability is definitely part of more modernization of DevOps, but also I think the cadence and the speed in which those releases are occurring is a large part of it, right? So, you know, cadence of release or partial releases, if you will, changes, enhancements, bug fixes, those type of things. Um, if you don't, there's no arguing that the speed of those releases on a daily basis is increasing, but what's really enabling, excuse me, not fully enabling, but what's enabling the security portion of being able to release at that speed is essentially those processes in the DevOps, which
Yeah.
are saying we're building this kind of testing in. We are making sure that as we're releasing or pushing or merging code, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, or even an hour, depending on who you are, that these tests are running. Whereas previously, as you mentioned, putting up the stop sign, stop, right? This is not what we're doing any longer. So the speed and scale together are really what's driving the normalization of these processes. Now, from a speed standpoint, um, is there anything specific that you saw perhaps in 2023 that would say, hey, something here is more evident for speed and release cadence as far
Yeah.
as like security goes?
Yeah, some of the things that I've seen in 2023 is that some of the blurring of some of the traditional lines with security tools, it's very easy to inundate with a lot of results. And generally speaking, when those things are done late in the process, frankly, developers are going to say that you're crying wolf, and they're going to listen less as time goes on, particularly when you have a vulnerability that's not, that's something that's could happen but doesn't really happen. In particular, this happens with SCA, software composition analysis, quite a bit, where software is nowadays composed of this mosaic of tons of open source stuff. And a vulnerability in one particular piece of that open source might be a critical vulnerability in that package, but it's really hard sometimes to know whether or not that is really impacted. Is it really something that is exploitable? Is it really something that a bad guy could hit? Just because you are using Log4j, for example, it's possible that you might have it's like used by a third-party library that doesn't log because it's turned off. So sometimes SEA,
Yeah.
like this noisy view of things. So in terms of like getting more speed, I think that one of the big factors for achieving speed is reducing noise and just showing developers what's real. And I think for AppSec, being able to have tools that say, hey, not only is this thing a real vulnerability, but here's an example of how it can be exploited is super important. One of the reasons I like Dast is that it does kind of drive real actionable results. If you can show a developer a curl command that writes something to their database, they can quickly make that connection and say, I've got to patch that. Likewise, I've seen SCA tools that are starting to do reachability analysis and
Yep.
say, hey, can I actually get into this entry point from this program that's vulnerable? And that sort of prioritization, that sort of saying what needs to be fixed first, I think is vital to getting speed. I think it's absent that, it just becomes a deluge of too much stuff to fix and too little time.
Right. No, no, I agree. And that's a perfect segue. So let's shift a little bit more. Let's just build upon that, right? So you mentioned DAST. Obviously, Invicti is leader in DAST. Uh, and so I want to focus on two things when we talk about DAST. And the one is the importance of actually having a good DAST program in two facets, right? The first one for me is making sure that you are doing some type of DAST in your CI/CD pipelines or your DevOps pipelines that are testing out an application or a piece of an application, depending on how you want to pare down that profile for speed. But testing that application before it goes to prod. That can be anywhere from non-production to a QA environment, etc. But it's that piece. But I don't want to ignore the importance also of running a comprehensive and continual DAST program on your external and even in your internal facing assets. So running these kind of continuous scans on your surface to understand what exactly the vulnerabilities are. Also, so this is a big topic, right? So also not only just finding out what those vulnerabilities are, but coming at it where saying, okay, we have something that's accessible and talking to maybe middleware or talking to databases. We're looking at server configuration as well in a way, right? Wherever that web app is housed, we have some type of configuration that is occurring to allow that web app to be accessible and talk to other background services. We're testing that config. And then last but not least, and I know this is a big one, was exactly what you mentioned, the noise,
Yeah.
right? The noise. Having something like our proof-based scanning or something similar that shows you, hey, here's a proof of concept that can recreate. You mentioned perfectly the curl, for example. So all of these are kind of like these pillars of DAST importance. And I want to focus on this again with a focus on 23, but maybe some of the things that we've seen this year in an uptick. So for me, the uptick this year has been very large scale continuous type of scanning on the surface, right? To understand a new piece of code or a new app is going to change, a configuration is going to change, it could even change dynamically. And make sure that we're constantly trying to scan and evaluate those type of apps. So I'm going to get your opinion on this. I know this is a huge topic, but I don't want to be like, hey, we're going to talk about DAST for the next 30 minutes. But this is a very important piece, especially from our perspective, that we've seen definitely change and make an impact in 23.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I did a local keynote recently, and one of the things that I spoke about there was taking a look at what's actively being exploited out there. If you go through the CISA top routinely exploited vulnerabilities, we've seen kind of a trend where RCE is something, remote code execution is something that's been more actively exploited. And we'll talk a little bit about what trends we see, right? We're in a great position to take a look at lots of scans and security trends in aggregate and have some interesting insights. But in this case, RCE is interesting because the amount of RCE has been going up. I took a look at this top 10, this top, N list from CISA, and I found that a lot of the exploits here, they're again, these old familiar faces that we know quite well. For example, one of them that happened recently within this year that is not just these are vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited. So this is the CISA kind of indicating something, saying, look, this is just not theoretical, but we
Yep.
see widespread exploit of these things. Path traversal, one where someone was putting in a few dots inside of a URL to get access to something that they shouldn't have been able to get access to. We saw a server-side request forgery, or SSRF. Again, things that DAST tests for, where someone was able to trick a remote API into calling something that was listening on localhost, right? Listening on something that was inside of the walls. We've seen code injection, server-side template injection. Again, a familiar face, something that you can test with a DAS tool, that you can run these combinatoric things. And it's just fascinating to see all of these individual things that go up. One of the Another one that is very commonly exploited was a hostile deserialization attack. One of the components of the Move It exploit, but we see it again in a different CVE that is being actively exploited. And this is the sort of thing where you are trusting the client to provide an object in a serialized number of bytes. Um, and by the time that you instantiate that as an object in developer terms, it's too late because the attacker can do whatever they want. That is a great example of a very easy thing to make a mistake on, and a mistake that we have seen evidence that it's being rapidly exploited. And again, a DAS tool can do that. It can spam all of these attacks and say, look, for all of your endpoints, maybe there's one that forgot to handle deserialization securely. That's what I like, is kind of being able to find that single thing and find it through evidence-based attacks, right? To show that an attacker can find it from the outside.
Yeah. And so, I mean, these are things, as you mentioned, right? We can look at all of these different types of detections, SSTI. We can look at things like deserialization, SQL injection, etc. Very, like what I mentioned earlier, is these are not new things. These are things that all of the new CVEs, or excuse me, a majority of the new CVEs that are actively being exploited and things like that, that are taking advantage of these very known type of vulnerabilities. I think one also, what you an advantage you also get from, let's say, running continuous external black box testing, if you will,
Yeah.
is you're approaching the problem from a even a very, very basic security standpoint as an attacker, right? So we know that the minute you stand something up on the internet that's externally accessible, it's getting scanned. Okay, well, why shouldn't I be doing that with a specialized product that looks at my outside surface for anything, any service that's available, anything that responds to a GET request on whatever port? It doesn't matter. Like, show me what's there. If I can identify parameters in which I can include payloads, let's do that. Let's look at this from an angle of an opportune attacker, right? Even if you aren't being targeted, these are things that occur on a daily basis. So, treating your apps and anything that essentially these days is your external footprint, which is everything, and approaching it with that type of rigor can provide the value in understanding what is out there from a DAS perspective, not even getting into the compliance and best practices where we know that we have to scan with DAS, we have to do things for PCI in a PCI environment for PCI compliance for DAS. But overarching to understand where this comes from government mandate on to common sense to understand, what do we have out there, and we should understand it before an attacker does. That kind of angle, to me, is extremely, the value-based proposition is just right there alone.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that Invicti is in kind of an interesting position where we have lots of scans that we can take a look at in aggregate to be able to say, hey, what are the trends that are out there? And we actually do have some evidence that we've seen in the past year arise in the frequency of scanning. So we've actually seen more customers that are scanning, not just once before they ship something to prod. I think this ties into industry trends in terms of how many times we're doing deployments. It ties into those industry trends of like the silent integration into CI/CD pipelines where scans are happening early and often. But we've seen a big increase, 50%, in the amount of time that people the amount of scans that are being done. And it's been actually positively correlated with a decrease, which is great to see. And the average app is now reporting kind of like fewer severe vulnerabilities than we've seen. It's a 19% decline, which is actually great news. So there's a correlation here. I don't know if it's causal, but we definitely see a correlation between those who scan fix, where this more frequent scanning does look like it results in things getting fixed, which is great to see. Now, that's not all rosy news, because we also have seen kind of a rise in some of the very worst types of vulnerabilities, which are rare to begin with. but they are being found with an increased frequency since last time. So remote code execution is one of those areas that
Yeah.
has kind of increased over time. And Frank, I'm kind of curious if you have any opinions on, RCE, why we're seeing it get bigger, what's going on in the world that's influencing some of that was
Yeah.
a 2023.
So a couple of things. If you run a basic scan on an application, it doesn't have vulnerabilities, it kind of disappears into obscurity, right? If you look at something, you're like, yeah, we scanned it, we use SCA, we use this, we use that. No one's really looking at it. But the thing is that we have so many common components
Yeah.
that are occurring within all of these applications that are being assembled and built is people are finding it worthwhile to dig into the stuff, in my opinion, that doesn't necessarily have inherent vulnerabilities, but what can I find that maybe is new? And if I can impact a component or I can impact a piece of code or a program that is used on such a wide scale, I have a pretty good incentive to go find something, especially RCE, where I have total control on said system. And what I think there is that the incentive is there, especially on the component level, to be able to have a greater impact financially, catastrophically, terroristically, however you want to look at it, to say, I'm going to find something in here and really focus on something that no one else is looking at. That's one perspective for the RCE. The others is I think we're seeing a little bit of like legacy and non-legacy getting smushed together in different types of applications where you might have accessibility into a legacy application where you might not have had before with a newer component. And there's a little bit of mix and match going on. That's my opinion. Curious on yours. What do you think is the main reason on the RCE piece? That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of analysis of this a while ago. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has something called the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database. And NVD, you can think of as the big library where all the CVEs, the common vulnerability enumerations, where
Yeah.
everything is stored, right? So if you take a look at the number of CVEs that are being reported, it's going up over
Yeah.
time. One of the subsets of that is growing kind of like quite alarmingly is remote code execution. So if you consider modern software to be this quilt of a lot of different open source components that are kind of like all kind of patchwork together to make a greater whole, we see that there's a rise in these kind of like really bad RCEs that are out there. Now, in some ways, it's kind of some economics at work, right? Like you mentioned, Frank, if you can find something that is a piece of that quilt that is commonly used everywhere, well, the power of that exploit is amplified. So I think that threat actors are kind of induced not to focus on an individual app, but find these infrastructure pieces. I think that's
Yeah.
reflected in the trends that we see in software. So more eyes in some ways is good because those more eyes do lead to shallow bugs, but there's a lot more eyes. And so you see this rise in incidents of RC that we actually do view. Like if you look at the data and take a look, our scans that are finding more, they do match that rise in kind of the level of reported RC that we see inside of the National Vulnerability Database.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you
I was
you could argue those always have been there, and I think they have always been there. We're
I
just now
agree.
seeing more, so it's a
Yeah.
good thing.
And our AppSec indicator report is a great source of data to look through the trends of these vulnerabilities. Like our data that we're using is millions of different data points from things like scans and things of that nature. We understand what's being found out there in the wild, what's being exploited, et cetera. So in order to be able to take it like a sample report or like an example, we release this report once a year to say, hey, what are the corollaries in this report that make some of these trends interesting is to me is beneficial. And it's interesting because there's also some things that surprise you, right? The more you scan, the more you fix. Like the overall vulnerabilities go down, but RCEs go up. Like the data doesn't always show what maybe you're expecting. And I find that to be extremely valuable when you're digging into the kind of causation of some of this.
Oh yeah, it's you can get absolutely lost in it's absolutely fascinating to drown in the sea of data occasionally.
Yeah. All right. So what I'd like to do now, Dan, is I have four things on my mind, and how we address these or how we take, shotgun approach to these, like we can. But I have four things that I want to make sure that we touch on. Some of these could be predictors for 2024, and some of these are things that I definitely want to focus on as like trends for AppSec as a whole, right?
Yeah.
Let's go down the list. We already talked about APIs and the prevalence of API security and API testing in 2024. That's one. So that's an easy one because we already addressed some of it. Second, I definitely would like to address AIML and LLMs and its ability to aid and evolve AppSec.
Yeah.
Uh, the third one I want to talk about is something that I'm seeing more of in this space, and that's ASPMs. Um, and the fourth, and that was from 2023 and 2022, kind of rolling into where we are today on ASPMs. And the fourth is if there's anything perhaps on the convergence of cloud native and cloud security, CNAPP type of platforms and AppSec. So those are the four things. We don't have a lot of time, but I do want to drill into these. Since
Yeah.
we did a really good job on the API side, I don't know if you have anything to add there. I do think that will be a prevalent kind of.
No, in fact, I'd like to jump in and just talk a little bit about LLMs, and I don't want to be
Let's do
like
that. Perfect.
thing, but I do think of all the things we've seen in 2023, it's a game changer. I have found just yesterday I was writing some code, and it's just it feels it's amazing. So much of the friction kind of goes away. Now, what it is really doing is automating the process of taking the collective wisdom and applying it into code. Now, this is both good and bad because the collective wisdom, just like the top comment on Stack Overflow, will probably be right, but there's no indication, right? I have seen instances of hallucination. I have seen instances of LLMs generating insecure code. It does happen. So I think that it's going to be a game changer from the security perspective because it'll accelerate the velocity with which code is produced. I myself can totally feel a difference, right? When I'm writing kind of unogged versus like, fully GPT'd up, it's a big difference. And I think that you're going to see a greater volume of code produced, which means that we're going to have less time to make sure that it's all okay. Automation, therefore, becomes so much more important as kind of a counter check, right? If a developer now is 5xing their previous productivity, you've got
Yeah.
to have to filter what's fire hose. The other aspect of LLMs that I think is really fascinating is their use for red teams, right? Their use for attackers. And it's going to be very interesting in 2024 to see what happens as LLMs start to be weaponized as ways to kind of like perform more active exploits. Now, with tools like ChatGPT, there's guidelines, there's guardrails that are in effect. If you ask ChatGPT, hey, how can I write some XSS to exploit this? It'll come back and it'll say, something like, hey, I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with any request to provide information that involves hacking, exploiting vulnerabilities, or engaging in any malicious activity. But one, there's ways to get around that. There's actually been papers out there that show that you will always be able to get around that through kind of tricky, prompt controls. And also, I think that you'll increasingly see threat actors that are running these things. I've got an LLM running locally that is jailbroken, right? That I was just playing around with. And, you can ask the same thing of the one that I'm running on my MacBook right now, and it'll happily give you an example of how to, give some code that'll exploit some basic XSS. So I do think you're going to see those tools will become just available. So I think
Yeah.
that you'll see LLMs kind of like raise the bar in terms of attack. And that's
Yeah.
something in 2024.
I agree. And, if we look back again, I like to look at history as a teaching moment for going forward. Um, we always said things like RAM is expensive. Yes, it
Yeah.
was. Storage was expensive. Yes, it was. Process compute is expensive. Yes, it is. So it's one of those things where LLMs are are expensive to run on a large scale, and they do cost money. However, at what point will the advantage of that cost outweigh the disadvantage of the expense as far as coming at it from a criminal perspective, right? Does it make sense to spend the money up front if you're going to make 2 times, 3 times, 8 times on the back?
Yeah.
So, these are all things that I definitely see evolving. Also, I don't see this like monopoly on LLMs, right? So yes, I can take nothing away from what OpenAI has contributed, right, to making mainstream Chat GPT, et cetera. However, this is the infancy of the mainstream of AI, and I think as AI evolves, you're going to see much tighter, more broad spread, but tighter internal usage of those that don't necessarily have some of the limitations, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and definitely there's a difference when you run a model with 9 billion parameters on a laptop is massively different than the performance that you'd see when you're using like a huge massive GPU in the cloud. But
Yeah.
good enough is going to raise the bar. So you might actually start to see the rise of almost I wonder if like red teaming as a service is something we'll start to see with those who compute, kind of like, much like botnets can be operated for commercial gain. I wonder if we'll start to see some of that where someone who has that server farm rents out a few queries to be able to come up with some interesting attack patterns. So it's going to be some interesting times.
Yeah, and part of that interesting piece as well is I am currently seeing LLMs used increasingly in bug bounties.
Yes.
So what we're doing there is there are a lot of circumstance in which we're cutting down on a lot of the manual processes and things that took time in the beginning, and we're kind of shortcutting to get to a certain point with the LLMs. So if people are doing that for legitimate bug hunts and bug bounty programs, it's safe to assume that others can do the same thing on the other side of it.
And just like programming, what it does, it's a lubricant that removes the friction, right? So you don't have to, oh, I forget how I need to format this header in order to trigger this thing that goes past this particular HTTP handler to get to the next level. It can help with that. It can help
Yeah,
with the aspects of it that often ends up being a lot of the time sink. So it's
yeah.
going to be more efficient.
Yeah, I think one of the main things, Dan, that you stated that really hits home is again that cadence, right? If the developer is 5xing their output, and it may not be today, whatever, but if they're at whatever xing their output, that is that much more code
Yep.
being written and generated and put out into the wild. Again, you mentioned the crack, right? That one crack in a vast landscape that only needs to be exploited, like in Move It, right? Where things of that nature, we're going to see that increase out there, and that's going to have to allow us to also scale our defenses 5x, right? If the amount of code is being 5x, for an example. But
Yep.
that's a huge part of it. I think that will often get overlooked as well.
Yep. Yeah, it's almost like a Drake equation for vulnerabilities. Given given a 5x increase in the amount of code that's out there, even if you allow for one line out of 1,000
Yeah.
or 10,000 of having something vulnerable, we'll simply see more of it because velocity increases. So yeah, it's going to be pretty
All right.
interesting.
So segue to our next bus. We'll leave some of these topics, but we have about 2 minutes. Was there anything in those four items that you felt would be worthwhile to close out on? Uh, I think we did a good job on AIML. I think we did a good job on API. The other two were things like ASPM and what they could do for risk, as well as perhaps some of the cloud native and CNAP crossover.
Yeah, so probably not time to go into those in depth, but I
No.
will say that ASPM is solving a problem of filtration of all of these things that are coming out. I see increasingly, unfortunately, that geopolitically, the last year, the year before it, have kind of shown that you know things are not super great. What that means is that there's going to be more of a rise of incidents. There's going to be more coming through the pipe that is noisy. Solutions that allow you to take a look at all of those things and filter down to the actionable are going to become, in my opinion, much more important in the coming years as kind of the environment for cybersecurity gets a little bit hotter, and as the amount of signal that comes, as the amount of noise that comes through, we're going to need better tools to be able to take a look and separate signal.
Yeah. I mean, this all ties together, right? We are 5xing our dev with AI/ML. We are producing at scale, at cadence, at speed. We are automating. We are producing more code. APIs are growing in prevalence. The amount of applications that are externally accessible, all of this stuff is growing at a rate where we're testing all of this stuff to we're testing all of these different pieces with SCA, with SAS, with DAST, with IAST, et cetera. With WAF. You know, we have all of this stuff out there that is running for security and code as code ramps up. That we now need to boil down into what's important. Where should I focus? I have 10 million alerts. Great. Which ones do I really need to look at? And I think that ASPM ties a lot of that together to be able to say, these are the things I need to concentrate on. These are my most risky, this asset is a higher priority and it has these other vulnerabilities that are found. I need to concentrate there first. It really is boiling down that ocean of vulnerabilities and signal to noise that we're having.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's a key there. I know we have to wrap. I really appreciate your time, Dan, and this was great. We're going to move on to questions at this point. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we'll try to perhaps do more of these in the future. But Dan, thanks for your time, and we'll move on to questions right now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for listening.